You know how you have that one game from your childhood that no one else seems to have ever even heard of, or one game that you love that seemingly no one else even likes? For me, that game is a 2001 budget FPS game called Deadly Dozen. It's a game that I've loved ever since getting its demo in a Sydney Royal Easter Show Pepsi show bag, but by all measures this has always been considered by the few who have even heard of it as just another dime a dozen unremarkable budget PC FPS from the early 2000s, and Lord knows there were plenty of those to go around. It didn't review particularly well, and it was quite shamelessly something of a knockoff of the far more popular game Hidden and Dangerous, where it was at times dismissed because of that. So to hear that this of all things was getting a remake over 20 years later blew my mind. People have been asking for a new Hidden and Dangerous game for years, while no one ever mentions Deadly Dozen. It felt like someone had greenlit this remake for me personally, or like I'd been transported into another dimension where Deadly Dozen was actually a huge successful game. It wasn't. It's normal that you haven't heard of it. Rest assured, as much as the store page descriptions and press releases like to market Deadly Dozen Reloaded as bringing a classic to a modern audience, the trailer even calls it a quote-unquote legendary tactical shooter, Deadly Dozen could never in a million years be considered as legendary or a classic. It's a cult game at best. I reviewed the original back in 2016, and when I did, there were only a few videos about it on YouTube. My review has about 50,000 views, far and away the most views about anything Deadly Dozen related, and my review of the sequel, sitting at about 30,000 views, is the second most viewed Deadly Dozen related video. I remember Googling Deadly Dozen around that time, and Google would give me a "Did you mean Dirty Dozen?" thinking I was trying to Google the film, which, in fairness, Deadly Dozen is something of an homage to that movie, or a ripoff if you're being less kind. They're both about sending a dozen misfits into a suicide mission in World War II. In the lead up to the release of Deadly Dozen Reloaded, publisher Ziggurat Interactive, who are a startup that seem to base their business model around buying random old PC IPs and reselling them on digital platforms, which they did with the original Deadly Dozen games, did their best to tweet out hype posts to little avail, with each one usually not even breaking into the double digits with likes. The Steam page, as of almost a week after the remake's release, has only a dozen user reviews, a deadly dozen, if you will, and the game wasn't deemed big enough to appear on Steam's new and trending tab. If I hadn't made a review of the original, which resulted in one of my viewers informing me about this remake, I'm not even sure that I would know that this exists, and there's a small chance that I am literally the biggest fan of the original. I hope I've painted a fair picture of just how shocked I am that this is real, of how otherworldly it is that this exists, because again, I still can't quite believe it. This all puts me in an interesting position since I'm covering this game. Like, having the audience that I do, I'm probably putting more eyes on this than Ziggurat Interactive has, and there's some responsibility in that. Like, I don't usually frame my reviews as a should you buy or wait for a sale or avoid entirely sort of thing. It's just not what I do, but in this case, I feel that I kind of have to, because some of you will check out Deadly Dozen Reloaded because of this video. No matter what I say about it, I am incidentally marketing this game, so I have to address whether or not it's worth buying, and for most of you, I'm not so sure it is. So to quickly explain why I love Deadly Dozen, it's a hard-as-nails, tactical, realistic-ish squad shooter like your Ghost Recons or Rainbow Sixes, or of course your Hidden and Dangerouses, where you command and control up to 3 teammates through an open outdoor level, completing objectives and scanning fog for bad guys. And while it was obviously made on the cheap and it isn't exactly the most original game, and it certainly has its flaws, it's fantastic at both immersing you in its intense situations and acting as a catalyst for unscripted and emergent moments. And to explain what I mean by that, by using an example I gave in my original review, after a grueling slog through a graveyard at night, you reach a long road to the exit of the level, and at the start of that road is a motorbike with a sidecar that only fits 2 people. So if you reach that point with a squad of 3 or 4, I had 4, then it puts you in an interesting situation. Do you take the bike, leaving 2 soldiers behind in the hope that you'll find a 4-man vehicle up ahead that you can use to come back for them? Do you ignore the bike and slowly push up the road as a group? Do you scout ahead using the bike to see how dangerous it is? The bike feels like the level designers are daring you to hop on and try your luck. And when I did, I flew past snipers firing at me from either side until I was stopped in my tracks by a tank. I quickly ran past the tank, doing my best in the moment to avoid getting blown to pieces, and just as my 2 soldiers' lives were flashing before their eyes, I came across a 4-man armored wagon, a godsend. So I hopped in, escaped the scene, grabbed my teammates, and raced to the end of the level. It was thrilling, it had me relying on my instincts, it was unscripted, and it was all thanks to a game that's been designed to create moments like this. And I was genuinely worried that my troops would die out there, because if they did, and I'd finished the level, they'd be dead for the remainder of the game. This game does have a form of permadeath. You have 12 troops, a dozen if you will, you pick 4 to take into each level, and there's 10 levels in the game. If 3 of your troops die in the first level, you have to finish the game with the remaining 9 guys. It's an elegant setup, and each guy has different stats that each have a huge impact on gameplay, whether they're a good medic, or good with explosives, or good at sniping, that sort of thing. Some guys are way better than others, so if you lose the guy that's both a good medic and good with explosives, you might have to replace him with 2 guys that specialize in each. Through this, you grow an attachment to the guys you like, and it's devastating when they die. Being such an ultra-hard, at times purposely unfair game where your entire squad can get wiped by a man and his dog if you're not careful, and where the consequences are so extraordinarily high if even one guy dies, it can be extremely tense and extremely rewarding if you make it through a level alive. So the remake has the task of recreating these feelings and moments, and maybe mixing up some of the things that were lacking in the first game. In a way, this is the perfect game to remake because it's a bit of a diamond in the rough, so let's see if those rough edges get smoothed out. The remake sticks to the original game's design closely, but still has a lot of tweaks. The characters and their stats are the same, the loadout screen works in the same way, each of the 10 levels have been recreated here, with some parts being changed or reimagined on a micro level, and even a lot of the sound effects and the fantastic orchestral soundtrack that flows up and down at all the right times are all here. Sure, it's cheap to not recreate the soundtrack for the remake, and the gunshot noises didn't get the update that they needed, like they play the one sound file over and over again every time you shoot with no variation, but the sound effects and soundtrack still do a good enough job at setting an atmosphere. What they did choose to update on the sound front was the voice lines, and the new ones are laughably terrible. They sound like programmers doing bad accents into their work-from-home microphones, and the quality of each line seems to vary between characters. Sometimes it'll sound okay, and then other times it really feels like you're listening to a gamer headset.
Woo doggy, we did it!
Safety's off.
That's one dead crowd.
They also don't whisper commands while you're sneaking, like it's always yelling, and the enemies can never hear that yelling apparently, which is a bit weird. Couple this with these hideous diamonds on your screen with off-center numbers to show you where your objectives are, and there's now these very video gamey markers you can tag your enemies with to know where they are at all times, even behind walls, which is pretty immersion breaking, and the characters in-game bafflingly have these nightmarish clown faces despite the otherwise realistic aesthetic, and I had trouble with the frame rate when I absolutely should not have, and the heads-up display itself is just really ugly as it's too big and it appears to use Unity's default Arial font rather than the more fitting font that the original game used, and my first impressions of this remake were undeniably very poor. It just feels really cheaply put together, which was deflating after spending 43 Australian dollars on it. I could be wrong, but it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of these 3D models were bought off of an asset store. I guess if I was being charitable, I'd say that being cheaply made is in line with the original game's spirit, and with the aid of some video editing cropping magic to get rid of that heads-up display, these environments do actually look quite nice. It's nowhere near a AAA game up close, as you'd expect, but that's masked by some quite striking visual design, and as such a fan of the original, it's lovely seeing these levels recreated here. That graveyard level with the wind blowing through the trees, the Fog sweeping past, the yellow glowing lamps, and off in the background you can see village windows lit up. It's just so atmospheric now. It's gorgeous. Or take the airport mission with a row of street lamps running far into the distance with a tank slowly creeping towards you while enemy planes fly overhead and buildings loom on cliff edges above. It's often a very atmospheric game obscured by a very, very ugly UI. Thankfully, you can and will want to turn off the objective markers and the enemy tags, which I gladly did immediately, and if the developers did buy some of these assets off a store somewhere, more power to them because they've made use of them wonderfully. I also like how it's still a fog shooter, but the draw distance has been massively extended and the fog looks far more realistic. I'm sure there was a temptation to remove the fog entirely because part of the reason it was in the original game was due to technical limitations, but thankfully the designers recognized that it's an important part of how Deadly Dozen flows. Let's throw away some nuance in favor of a two-columned table. Things the original Deadly Dozen does better, and things the remake does better. We can already fill out a few things, and another thing that the remake does far better is the third-person mode. No longer does your character's head get in the way of aiming, animations are smooth enough, and I happily played through a couple of levels like this. Oh, and we actually have real reload animations now. Oh, the joy. The AI was super threatening in the original game because they were incredibly good shots, but beyond that, they weren't smart. They'd often just run in a straight line towards you, making it super easy to line up a headshot, but now they dodge roll out of the way and will retreat behind cover sometimes, and it is so much better. They're still not the best. They seem to completely break when using a turret, but their unpredictability is a vast improvement over the original game. Add it to the list. Reloaded recreates that part in the graveyard with the bike and the sidecar, and again, I couldn't help but risk taking the bike to go and retrieve the wagon. I gunned it down the dirt path, doing my best to mow down anyone I could. I flew past the tank before it could get a shot off. I was loving my luck until I came across the wagon, and then this happened.
I'll do it.
My guys were killed, the bike was demolished, the car blown up by a tank, and I was devastated. This was only level 2, and I'd have to beat the game without 2 of my guys. 2 of my best guys too, because I'd made the mistake of sending them in rather than my less skilled lads, who I cautiously tiptoed to the exit, doing my best to hide from the enemy tanks. The thing is though, as I loaded into the next level, the 2 guys that died were right there alive and well, available for selection again, because it turns out that this game has removed permadeath, which completely undermines the point of having a dozen different guys, and it just really annoys me to no end. 12 guys, 10 levels was so elegant. Like, why would you ever not pick the 4 best guys over and over again? It's not even an option to turn on permadeath, they've just removed it entirely. No more permadeath. Lose a soldier on a successful mission? Have no fears, that soldier will be back amongst the dozen in your next mission in Deadly Dozen Reloaded. So this is something the original game definitely does better, but me being me, I kept a written list of who died, made sure never to select them, and I had a far better time because of it, because that's how the game was designed back in the day. Developers, if you're watching, please at least patch in permadeath as an option. And this is where I found out that enemy tanks in this game are terrifying, as they should be. In the original, it was far too easy to avoid tanks. They were actually less threatening than regular enemies, and this was one of my biggest problems with the game, but here it's much harder to avoid them, and if they do get a shot off, you're as good as dead. If you're with your squad, your entire squad will die in one hit. Just knowing that a tank is nearby is scary. Drivable vehicles, as it turns out, are far more volatile. In the original, they were so overpowered that whenever you came across a vehicle, you may as well hop in because you'll be protected. And that was a lot of fun because vehicles were placed sparingly and they sort of served as this nice reprieve from all the stress. Here though, a few shots from a mounted machine gun will destroy any vehicle, so whether or not you choose to drive them is a far bigger decision. If you're down to your last guy, maybe fanging it in a car to the exit is a better bet than trying to walk alone. If the objective is to drive a vehicle across the map, it's probably best to clear the path ahead first. It's more realistic this way, and it adds another layer of decision making, but it sacrifices the cathartic element the original game had, so let's call this a tie. The handling is way too slippery in the remake though, so points for car handling goes to the original. Points also go to the original for having the character stats matter more. In the remake, it feels like any guy can use any weapon reasonably well, whereas in the original, if you didn't have a sniper sniping or an explosives guy exploding, then you were in trouble, which added a lot of depth. Medics still matter in the remake, and the stats do still matter to some extent, but you don't have to think about them as much. One of my favourite levels in the original has you fighting your way through a war-torn city, and it's been beautifully reimagined here. The storm clouds with the blown out sunset behind them, the dead trees, the bombed buildings, the mud, the rubble, and the constant fear that an enemy is hiding in a window. It is extraordinary how grim this level feels. I carefully commanded my squad around the outskirts of the city, making sure to keep my enemies in front of me until I reached an outpost of turrets on a bridge that I was meant to capture. Rather than take the long road down to my sure death, I decided to approach through the buildings to the left, clearing them out one by one and using them as cover. The plan was going well until it wasn't. Joseph, my medic, caught the attention of a guy with a rocket launcher while clearing out a building. Jean-Claude, my sniper, got taken out by a turret amidst the chaos that followed, and Worm didn't stand a chance, getting wiped by some sort of explosive, which left me with Andrew Bollinger, a fairly ordinary soldier. Carefully sneaking out of that town alive on my own with snipers breathing down my neck in every building was terrifying. I scavenged for any spare bullet or health kit I could find. I tiptoed through buildings trying not to make a sound. My heart was racing. Just before making it to the exit, I saw a tank coming at me from afar and hid behind a building to let it crawl past as the rattle of its tracks got louder and louder. While hiding, I was spotted by an enemy behind me and had to rely on my instincts to fight him. Thankfully, I won and made it out alive. And it was every bit as immersive and intense as the best moments in the original game were. I loved it. I still love how Deadly Dozen does away with the overhead of involved planning screens or inventory management, and it just lets you lean on your instincts and skills. Its focus is more on placing you in these situations rather than asking you to tactically execute a perfect plan. And the remake, for all its differences, successfully recreates that core. It helps that the gunplay, as rudimentary as it is so intuitive in both games, requiring quick reflexes and thinking on the fly. With the aim-down sights and every unit having 3 grenades you can throw with a single button press, and the better weapon feel, it's safe to say the gunplay is an improvement in the remake. By the time I reached the final mission, I was 11 guys down. Old reliable Andrew Bollinger, who'd somehow survived every single mission from the start while watching all his teammates die around him, found himself alone and up against the biggest challenge in the entire game, and it was every bit as intense as you'd expect. I really missed my teammates as I retried over and over to sneak past as many enemies as possible. Every path I chose to take, every firefight I found myself in, every weapon I chose to pick up, had me making these sometimes split-second micro decisions to try and minimize any risk. And I got to engage with the stealth mechanics more, as the game would tell you when you're invisible hiding in bushes. The feeling of being up against it and getting in and out completing the mission alone was amazing, and it captured all the same feelings I loved from the original. I could tell many more stories of all the things that happened in just one playthrough, and that's the beauty of Deadly Dozen. You can look at the little table I made, and there are things I wish the remake carried over from the original, like particularly the character stat stuff and permadeath, and it's a shame that the remake isn't an improvement across the board, but when it comes down to it, both games pull off the same end goal. But, and this is a huge but, I still struggle to give a recommendation to Deadly Dozen Reloaded. It comes with enormous caveats that I think would and should turn off most people. For one, it's borderline broken in some ways, like even ignoring the terrible performance, rockets clip straight through tanks unless you're right up close, and with ammo so scarce, that's incredibly frustrating. Not once did the fire at will command ever work for me. Like, every time I tried, my teammates said that they couldn't see the enemy I was aiming directly at. There were plenty of times that I shot invisible walls. The collision models in this game are absolutely horrible at times and can leave you wasting precious ammo trying to shoot through an invisible gap. They were bad in the original game too, so it's sort of ridiculous that that hasn't been fixed here, and unacceptable for a game that is again 43 Aussie dollars. Maybe a patch will fix some of this stuff, but you know, maybe it won't. There's also so many obvious areas of improvement that just aren't capitalized on. What stats actually do still isn't explained. There's still two difficulty settings, realistic damage and difficulty, and neither of those are explained either, and they seem to work differently from how they used to. I found the best results were medium difficulty with realistic damage on, but I wish it just said what they did so I didn't have to experiment with them. The more useless items are still not worth choosing over a health pack, like why not give every guy a throwable coin to distract enemies without it taking up an inventory slot? It's not like coins are physically big items. Same goes for pistols. And why do I have to pause the game to view the map now? It was more immersive to view it in real time. Also, the map doesn't say which objective is which, the AI breaks too often, and there's still no jump or climb button. And while I appreciate how faithful the remake is, I think they could have potentially added some new features. Maybe smoke grenades could have added more depth, maybe being able to go prone like in Deadly Dozen 2 could have added more depth, maybe let the vehicles smash through small fences, maybe let the squad shoot from out the windows of vehicles to make them more viable. Bullet drop with wind could have made the sniping more interesting instead of just the basic hit scan again. And even if you can put up with all of Deadly Dozen Reloaded's issues, to get the most out of it, you have to resist save scumming, keep track of all your units who have died yourself, figure out through trial and error alone how to best load out and which commands work properly. There's just a lot to put up with, and if I wasn't such a fan of the original game, I'm really not sure I would have. Maybe I'm asking too much for a game that appears to have been developed by 3 people, or a game that seems to barely have an audience, but I don't think it's too much to ask for a game that cost me $43, or $30 if you're in the States. Only a director, designer, and programmer are credited, and the developer is listed as Enfusion Interactive, who made the original game. Going off an interview with the director, this seems to entirely be a passion project, which does make me appreciate it more from that perspective. It does feel like a labor of love, and it's sort of comforting to know that at least the developers themselves love Deadly Dozen as much as I do, if not more. So when all is said and done, while I can only recommend this to someone at their own risk, if I was to recommend it at all, I guess I'd say for most people this is a wait for a sale at best. On a purely personal level, I'd be lying if I said I didn't absolutely love my time with Deadly Dozen Reloaded, and buying it full price, for me at least, was entirely worth it. Of course I liked it, it's as if it was made for me. It's so surreal that a flawed favourite of mine has been reimagined, and even if the remake is flawed too, it's reaffirmed to me that at its core, Deadly Dozen, once you break its shell, is truly a timeless and special video game. And there we wrap up the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd appreciate if you did all the algorithm stuff like commenting and liking and sharing. Much like how this game seems to be a passion project for the developers, this video was a bit of a passion project for me. It's just a game I care about a lot more than most people do apparently. This has a lot of dislike reviews on Steam, or not recommend reviews on Steam. Which is fair enough given how sort of janky it is. Back in the day, there was an expansion pack for the original game that included 2 extra missions. They aren't included here, but if they ever get patched in, that'd be cool. Apparently, this game is getting released on consoles. It's going to come to Switch supposedly later this year, so that'll be interesting to see if that ever happens. You can check out my old reviews, including my review of the sequel, Deadly Dozen Pacific Theater, but be warned that they are really old reviews. When I made that first review, I think I had 100 subscribers or 110 subscribers or something, which is crazy to think about. And yeah, thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons who've been coming up on the screen. Hope you've all been well, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.